Nobody asked, but here are a couple of movies that changed my life. The Out-of-Towners with Jack Lemmon. It's the first movie I ever saw at a drive-in with my parents. Scared me out of New York City for years. Superman with Christopher Reeves. I believed a man could fly. Serpico with Al Pacino. I saw a topless woman on screen for the first time. Yes, I'm actually grinning when I'm saying that. Star Wars. I was lucky enough to be at the red carpet New York City premiere. And when that first battlecruiser went overhead, seemingly overhead, across the 70-millimeter screen, I never looked at movies the same way again. And then there was the first time I saw porno in a movie theater. I was working at the old Royal Park Theater 4 in Gainesville, Florida, and we showed Debbie Does Dallas at a 5 p.m. show. Good thing I saw that show. The police confiscated our print thereafter. So that brings us to my guest today, Variety Magazine's senior editor Robert Hofler, who is author of a fun new book called Variety's The Movie That Changed My Life. Robert, welcome to Mr. Media.
Well, good to be here.
How are you today?
Fine.
So I think it's logical, but the first question I have for you is, what movies changed your life?
Well, there was a movie that changed my life before I saw it, and that was Cleopatra, because there was the whole Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, love triangle, and I was just taken with the sex of all that. I mean, you'd have to come up with something comparable that today it would have to be, Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston had 2 kids, and then Angelina Jolie broke them up, and then she threw him aside to take off with Russell Crowe. I mean, that's the level that you'd have to go to. And then also Cleopatra cost $40 million, which would be $400 million today, and it practically bankrupted studios. So that combination of sex and money, I think, led me directly to becoming an entertainment journalist. Now, the movie itself, even at age 10, I realized was a big bore. That was certainly a movie that had a real impact on me.
Any others? I mean, that was pretty early on.
Well, before that, I remember I saw Giant, and I fell in love with that house. And, I just begged my parents, you've got to take me to Texas because I've got to find that house, which, of course, did not exist, except as a kind of a prop. And then around that time, I also saw the 10 Commandments, and I was so taken with all that blue screen, which I didn't realize how it was done, but, it was all done via blue screen. But I was just fascinated with that movie. And again, I think it was another one that really led me to being an entertainment journalist. Also, I've seen a movie with Olivia de Havilland and Montgomery Clift. It was made in 1949 called The Heiress, and I've seen it throughout my life. I've probably seen the movie 20 times, and I always react to it differently each time I see it. This kind of innocent, girl who is very made callous by a bad love affair and a cruel father. And I keep vacillating how I interpret that movie, and it depends whether I was a kid in college, a young adult, or middle-aged. My view of that has always changed over the years, and I always find it fascinating.
Now, curiously, I noticed you did not mention any comedies in that group.
No, I honestly don't. I honestly feel that comedies endure better than dramas, actually, that even though they don't get the Academy Awards, that they endure quite well. But I have to say that I think people have either a tragic or a comedic view of life, and mine a little bit more tragic. So I think that is the one thing, though, in interviewing people for the book, because we interviewed we interviewed 120 celebrities. It is interesting that both you and I mentioned films we saw when we were young, and I think that is pretty much what I did not expect when I started this project, which began as a feature in Variety. Was that it really was an exploration of people's childhood and young adult years. Movies that really impacted them, and that was true from, Jack Nicholson to Sarah Jessica Parker to Paul Krugman and, Donald Trump, whomever we talked to. It was generally a movie they saw in their youth.
Well, I want to take a second and just give out our phone number, encourage people if they'd like to call in and tell us the movie that changed their life. give us a call, 1-646-595-3135. Well, that was quick. All right, we've already got a call. Let's see. Hi, do you have a comment or a question for Robert Hofler, or would you like to tell us the movie that changed your life? And they're gone. Okay, well, we'll keep going. How did the editors at Variety hit on this concept for a book?
Well, it was done as a very long feature of about 20 pages in Variety. And it was going to be, my favorite movie. And what we were going to do is talk to famous people who were not in the movie industry. It was going to be people outside the industry. And I found when I put out the request that it was kind of like asking people, oh, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite? And people did not respond. And then so when I phrased it as, well, what's the movie that changed your life or had a big impact on you? People took that more seriously. And it does provoke more, even though the movie that maybe changed a person's life is a favorite movie, or it is a great movie, but not always. I mean, quite often people talked about movies that they saw that, they actually didn't consider, very good when they, saw them many years later. I mean, Gore Vidal was one who saw The Mummy, and, he wanted to be an archaeologist for, a few months. And so he talked about that, but, I don't think that he would consider that a good movie today.
Who surprised you?
Well, there were a couple of them, from Ray Bradbury to Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who I don't know if he's still on track to be the next Surgeon General, but he's a brain surgeon, and there's the old, line, which was like, well, it's not brain surgery. So I always expect when I talk to someone who's a brain surgeon that they're going to come up with a very intellectual choice, and he came up with Rocky. And he completely did not disown it. He says, I just love rah-rah movies. And I think, again, it goes back to his childhood. He grew up as the child of immigrants. He was Indian American in a small town in Michigan, in which no one else had a name like Gupta. And I think there was something, he made a transference there, and there was this kind of outsider, kind of not very good boxer who was an underdog with Sylvester Stallone in Rocky. And so he really responded to that story, and that was kind of a surprise. Although I find that very true of people from ethnic minorities, a number of gay people, a number of gay celebs that we talk to, that sometimes they do not see themselves on screen, or certainly the older people we talk to did not see themselves on screen. And so they either made a transference from one group to another, or they felt very left out by it, that they were not validated by the movies. And I think we do look to the movies not only to see ourselves, but a more idealized, a more glamorous view of ourselves. And a number of people who belong to minority groups did not find that. I do have to find that there was one, though, who did, although we don't think of it as a minority group, but Peggy Noonan, who wrote speeches for Reagan and also has a column for the Wall Street Journal. She said that as a girl growing up on Long Island, she, really loved the way Hollywood presented Irish Americans. And, of course, there were so many great stars that she was able to see herself on screen, whether it was Maureen O'Hara or John Wayne or James Cagney, Spencer Tracy. So she kind of took the opportunity to talk to Variety and thank the moguls of the 40s and 50s for doing that. The other big surprise was Ray Bradbury, because he talked about seeing Singin' in the Rain, and to him Singin' in the Rain was a great science fiction movie because it was about how an invention changed the world, and that was sound movies. And he really saw science fiction in a different way after seeing Singin' in the Rain. And it might be a coincidence, but I don't think so, that he saw Singin' in the Rain and a couple of years later wrote Fahrenheit 451, which I would not think that there's any connection between Rain and Fahrenheit 451, but for Ray Bradbury there is.
Were the interviews for the book, were they conducted specifically for the book, or were they collected from existing material?
We originally did 50 very short profiles, like 100, 200 words. But at the time, I got so involved in the project that I kept the interviews and expanded them for the book. And then we came up with another 70 profiles, pretty much most of which are original, and they were never published in Variety.
Oh, okay. Were there people who were interviewed for this that did not make the cut?
Well, it was a question. Once I realized that it was a book, I would ask, I work here as an editor, so I assign a lot of writers to do things, and every once in a while I would say, oh, you've got Anne Hathaway on the phone because she's getting some award. Could you ask her about the movie that changed her life? And there were a few people that we would bring it up. I remember Lindsay Lohan. I was interviewing for something else. And I said, oh, what's the movie that changed your life? And I'm trying to think. She mentioned a Marilyn Monroe movie, but she didn't have very much to say about it, so I didn't include that. But Anne Hathaway talked a lot about Pretty Woman, and a musical that was done by Bob Fosse, which was autobiographical, called All That Jazz, and she really kind of saw All That Jazz as, really, because she really wanted to be a Broadway dancer, and so that's how she got into show business. Was she wanted to be a Broadway chorus girl, and her career went in a different direction, but she kind of looked back at the movie All That Jazz.
I can see All That Jazz influencing people. It was in the introduction I mentioned. It's a movie
that actually came up quite a bit. The director of the Hayden Planetarium in New York, I think I'm going to mispronounce his name here, but Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, or Tyson deGrasse. Anyway, he's written a lot of books on black holes and whatever, and if you watch the Jon Stewart show, he's on it all the time. Anyway, he talked about All That Jazz as being kind of very instrumental, and while he was studying to be a physicist, he also took a lot of dance classes and used to do, dance competitions, and, he just adored All That Jazz.
I was going to say that when I worked in the movie theater in college, All That Jazz played there. That, I guess it kind of dates me for anybody who's trying to figure that out. But because it played such a long time, I saw it so many times, and it had an influence on me. I mean, I studied film, and I thought watching that, it had a very interesting structure. A lot of blackouts and blackout scenes, and a lot of things going on at the same time, in addition to the dance and the music and Roy Scheider. As a matter of fact, the thing I'm just thinking about it, when I guess Roy Scheider died last year, perhaps, when the Academy remembered him, I don't think they showed a clip from that movie. And I thought, okay, who doesn't know their movie history? I mean, of all the things you would show Roy Scheider in, I would think Jaws and All That Jazz would have to be the top two, because they would show such a range. But
I'm not sure. I think they also showed him in The French Connection. I'm not sure. I thought there wasn't All That Jazz. I think that they did, 2 or 3 little clips, and a lot of famous people died last year.
Well, yeah. But I mean, that was.
I heard a lot of criticism that there should have been more on Paul Newman. But then I remember the year that they did a special feature on Stanley Kubrick, and then another special feature on Frank Sinatra. Everyone complained, "Oh, why are they wasting time on these, obits?" But that the Oscars actually is my next book.
Oh, really? Okay, so
I'll take them on.
We'll come back to that later. I do want to ask you about that. But I mean, I would just think that particularly people who wound up in show business, in the livelier arts anyway, that All That Jazz would have been influential.
This feature originally started that we were not going to ask people in show business because there's a very direct connection with Sarah Jessica Parker seeing Woody Allen in Sleeper and going, oh, I want to be a comedian. And there's a very direct connection in Jack Nicholson saying, oh, I saw Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront, and I, immediately moved to Hollywood. We weren't, although the book has a lot of those stories in it, we were more interested in people like Tom Brokaw, seeing His Girl Friday and wanting to be a journalist. We were more interested in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. seeing To Kill a Mockingbird and wanting to be an activist lawyer. So it was those kinds of stories that we were more interested in, how this medium, which, traffics in the fictional actually had an impact on, real lives, and not just an actor is inspired by another actor, so they become an actor. That kind of thing. Although there's plenty of those stories in it. And also we spoke to a number of actors such as Richard Gere, who did not want to be an actor because he saw a movie, but he said he became a pacifist because he saw The Longest Day with his father. And I always thought of The Longest Day as a rather gung-ho World War II movie, but he said because he saw it with his father, who was in World War II, and his father was very anti-war, because of that experience, they had a conversation afterwards, and it was that whole kind of Saturday afternoon with his father, and they're seeing the movie together and talking about it, that really led him to be a pacifist. And I do find that true with a lot of the people we spoke to. It wasn't just the act of seeing a movie, but seeing it with a parent and then talking about it afterwards. That had a huge impact on a number of people.
You mentioned Sarah Jessica Parker and Sleeper, and I also remember seeing in the book that Candace, oh my goodness, who created Sex and the City, Bushnell, thank you, that show was influenced by Annie Hall. Woody Allen show up more often than the two times I'm remembering?
He didn't show up as much as I thought he would. There is a TV psychologist, maybe he's a psychiatrist, but anyway, Dr. Drew Pinsky, who saw Manhattan when he was in college, and there was a whole idea of the romance of Manhattan, both the city and the movie that, made him want to live there. And there were other things, kind of psychological things about Woody Allen that he really liked, and he thought it kind of led him to, possibly take up a career in psychology. But Woody Allen, actually, out of those three things, did not come up as much as I thought he would. The movie that came up the most, and probably the director who came up the most, was Stanley Kubrick, and that's with 2001. And people had radically different ways in which 2001 affected them.
Let me come back to 2001 in a second. I was just thinking about Manhattan, and I remember what impressed upon me from that movie was it was the first time that I remember thinking, oh, this type of music, it's not what I thought it was. I thought it was all, Chopin and Mozart, but Gershwin, where did that come? I'd never heard it before, and I thought, wow, I really got to open my eyes to something besides, what's on album rock stations at the time. So that had a big impact. Now, 2001 and Kubrick, it kind of leads to something else I wanted to ask you. Did you find that there were people who were giving you answers that they thought you wanted to hear because they thought, oh, well, if I say, A Clockwork Orange, that's going to make me seem more intellectual or more eclectic or something? Or do you think people spoke from the heart?
No, people had a pretty good sense of humor about it. And I did not find that to be true. Maybe there was a little bit of that with the politicians. Howard Dean mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird. I don't know if he felt that, that was a... I got To Kill a Mockingbird quite a bit, particularly with people who were political liberals. But then again, I think it is a movie that influenced people. When I talk to political conservatives, quite often I got kind of John Wayne Westerns, and I got John Wayne, World War II movies, and there seemed to be kind of a fixation on violence that, political conservatives like Newt Gingrich and John McCain had. And there was a little bit of a divide there. But no, when you're speaking to people, I kind of got that, and the things made sense to me. I mean, Rick Fox picking Hoosiers. Well, why wouldn't Rick Fox pick Hoosiers? Sure. I mean, it's, basketball. There was, the editor of a bride's magazine. I'm kind of blanking on her name right now. And so she picked a lot of wedding, movies. Well, of course, it just kind of makes sense that they would go in that direction.
I think McCain also picked Viva Zapata. Now, McCain's an interesting case because there seems to be these two sides to the man. There's this side where he's he's a funny man, and he's got a good sense of humor and a very light side about him. And then there's this side of him that is so eager to succeed that he'll accept or adapt to whatever way the wind is blowing, and so he may say things. I would have loved to see McCain mention, I don't know, Some Like It Hot or Animal House or something that would just show that side of him, I guess.
Well, actually, he did. I mean, certainly, it is the movie that changed my life. And, of course, sometimes I would say that to people, and they would go like, oh, well, no movie has the power to do that. And then I'd say, okay, tell me about a movie that changed your life a little bit. And so, then you kind of get into it. Yeah, you had to slap some of these people around, and then there were a lot of people, who just, rejected the question altogether. And, of course, they weren't interviewed. But, he did talk, kind of at length about Marilyn Monroe. And he thought, it wasn't just that he was hot for Marilyn Monroe. He thought Marilyn Monroe was the greatest actress ever. And I think he actually did mention Some Like It Hot, if you see that movie. Now, whether it changed his life or not, I don't know. I do have to say, though, that sex and romance were a way in which a lot, the movies really, really have impacted people. And I think the way in which we see ourselves as men and women and, desirable people, romantic people, whatever, that the movies, I'm not sure that anything has a greater impact on us than the movies and now television.
Now the book is.
And I got.
Go ahead.
And I got, ideas having to do with, certainly Bill Maher talked about Some Like It Hot, that he was completely turned on by the love scene between Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis. And you certainly have Steve Carell talking about, I think as you did with, I forget which movie was the first time you saw a naked woman in the movies, but for him, Ryan's daughter. Right. And so, they definitely thought that those had changed their life. Also, another one, Doris Kearns Goodwin, very well known now, particularly with Team of Rivals, which we keep on hearing about with Obama and his cabinet. But she thought she had to really unlearn everything that she learned from the movies about romance. And the book is 120 Celebrities Picked the Movies That Made a Difference, for better or worse. And that movie for her was Gone with the Wind. And, she wanted to fall in love with Rhett Butler and, had to learn that Rhett Butler was not husband material. She also had to unlearn everything about the Civil War, having seen Gone with the Wind. But she did think the movie inspired her to learn about history.
Now, you point out in the book that it's interesting how very different people could pick the same movie. That Doris Kearns Goodwin picked Gone with the Wind, but so did Phyllis Schlafly, I think, right? Yeah.
That was another one. And, for Phyllis Schlafly, it was all about survival, and she thought the movie had a huge impact, and also the book, upon the country, because it was during the Depression, and, survival, and it showed people how to survive. So, that's what she took away from the movie, and that was very impactful for her. 2001 is the one, Larry King, talked about he learned how to hate computers because of, 2001. The New York Times columnist Frank Rich, who used to be a theater and film critic, learned about a new kind of narrative from 2001, and it really expanded his idea of what the movies could be, which certainly impacted him as a film critic. And then there's Esa-Pekka Salonen, who leads up the LA Philharmonic, who saw 2001 in Helsinki when he was 10 years old on a big screen. And, he learned about transitions in art, and he talked about how many musicians have told him, that one of the great transitions in art is when the ape throws the bone into the air, and then the bone turns into a spaceship. And that, a number of musicians particularly, kind of relate to that as a very important visual transition, which they have been able to then, translate into one having to do with music. It's
interesting how some of the celebrities and their key movie that changed their life seem to match up real well, and others don't. For example, Bill Maher, MASH, Fantasia from American Idol, Lady Sings the Blues, Ariana Huffington, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then there's one that just you go, huh? You have Perez Hilton, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
Oh,
sorry.
Uh-huh.
That
well, it's
not the one I would have expected.
It's a fantasy, and so also Selma Hayek talked about seeing Willy Wonka and Sarah Jessica Parker. So they all saw this movie, and it was the fantasy. It was the possibility of this fantasy world that they could enter into, and that kind of, I think, in all respects, turned them on to, in some way or another, either wanting to enter show business or to comment on show business. And of course, Perez Hilton is a pseudonym. I'm not even sure what his name is. It is in the book, but he liked putting together this kind of Latino outsider name with Perez Hilton, and I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of fantasy at work there. I suppose the one though that's probably really strange is that Newt Gingrich picked Trader Horn, and I think of all the movies that people, I'm not even sure that I've seen Trader Horn, but he had seen it when he was like 11 years old, and he was living in Georgia, and he was turned on by Africa, or the movie's vision of Africa and its animals. And so he went to City Hall and, demanded that they, create a city zoo. And for some reason, some reporter got a hold of it and then took him into, a council meeting. And so here was this 11-year-old kid talking about how he wanted a city zoo. And, because the reporter realized he had a good human interest story, he wrote about it on the front page. And I actually think it did spark a debate, and I think that town actually got a zoo. And it kind of drummed up support for it. But anyway, it led him to being a politician.
One of the things I really like about the book is that, just as it has here in this conversation, it just seems like a great conversation starter, whether you're at the water cooler or you're at a party. Is that part of what you had in mind, or is that just a lucky thing?
No, it really was, for those of us who work at Variety, it was a way in which, again, the original project had no movie or TV stars, no actors, directors, anything to do with the entertainment business. And we really wanted to show the impact of movies, a direct correlation between, this fantasy medium on reality and how, life was imitating art. And the best way to do that was to go to these people who were not involved with the movies, whether it was, Frank Rich or Newt Gingrich or John McCain or Paul Krugman, and the list goes on, and to really show that. And that's what it was. What we kind of learned, though, as we got into the project, is that it was a great way to get people to talk about their childhood. And if you've interviewed people, a number of times people will go like, no, I don't want to talk about, I want to keep this focused on my career. I don't want to talk about my personal life. And all of a sudden people were talking about their personal life, and in quite detail. So that was interesting for us.
I want to take the last segment to talk a little bit about your employer, Variety Magazine. How long have you been at the magazine?
About 12 years. Wow. I've kind of gone back and forth between New York and Los Angeles, and right now I'm an editor in Los Angeles. But for most of that, or for a long period of that, I was the theater reporter for Variety, and I was covering Broadway in New York.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I saw that Patti LuPone was in the book, and I actually had her on the show yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
See, those were one. I think she saw 3 movies when she was about 10 years old, and it was not the theater that turned her on to the theater. It was the movies that turned her on to the theater. And, she saw things like West Side Story and even Lawrence of Arabia, which she thought was the best entrance any actor could have when Omar Sharif, comes in the desert, that was the best ever.
Well, it would seem, to an outsider at least, that would be a very cool place to work, no matter what you're covering. Is it true?
It is, and there's a little, I was amazed at how many journalists I spoke to, whether it was Tom Brokaw or Arianna Huffington or Lawrence Wright, who wrote a book on 9/11. How many of them mentioned His Girl Friday with Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant, and they liked the romance of that kind of newsroom. And there's still a little bit of that at Variety, so that's fun. And also it's kind of irreverent because Variety has what we call its own slanguage, and that goes way back. That goes, a lot of it goes back to vaudeville, and even the name Variety, it was another name for vaudeville. And in the beginning, because Variety's a little over 100 years old, it really was, kind of variety shows and vaudeville. It really wasn't Broadway. That the paper covered in the beginning. It was all these kind of reviews and stuff on the road and whatever.
Well, and of course you still there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The line just went dead for a second. Of course, the classic. I don't even know if this was ever actually a headline in Variety or if it was just in the movies, but it was Hicks, Nicks, Sticks, Picks.
Oh yeah, no. That's probably the most famous one.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's probably the most famous one, and probably the other big one was Wall Street Lays Egg, and that was the stock market crash of 1929. But those are probably the two most famous. And the Hicks Sticks, I think, goes back to the 20s also.
Yeah, that was a great one. I imagine that working in New York for Variety very different from working in Hollywood in terms of.
Well, Variety started in New York, and then had, certainly an LA office, I think, opened here maybe in the late 20s or something like that. But its major office was in New York until I think about 1990, and then its major office moved to LA, and right now, there's a rather small staff in New York, and there's a business person, and there's a couple of theater people, and I might be missing one other. But the entertainment business outside of the theater really is very much focused in LA now, so that's where Variety is.
Obviously, the magazine and newspaper business are having a hard time these days. We all know that. Print seems to be disappearing. Is the future for a trade like Variety, is it strictly online, or is there still demand for the print product?
There's still demand for the print product, and I think there will be for a slightly different reason than most publications. And I think that people who read Variety kind of in Hollywood particularly, they kind of like to be seen reading Variety because it says I'm in the motion picture business or I'm in the TV business, where you don't get that with the New York Times or the LA Times, so there's no reason to be having an actual, print copy. But I don't know. The whole newspaper business is changing a little faster than I thought it would even 5 years ago. And this seems to be kind of like a huge transition. But, it's one of those things where, who knew that Wall Street and banking and all of this stuff would be going on right now, too? That's another huge transition and how that's all changing.
Oh, Robert, I knew. You could have just asked me a few months ago. I would have told you exactly what was going to happen. Yeah, right. All right. So before we finish up, you said you already know what your next book is that's going to be on the Oscars. Tell us a little bit about what.
Well, part of it's on the Oscar. It's actually about a man named Alan Carr who died about 10 years ago.
Sure.
He was a Broadway and a film producer who got his wish in 1989 to produce the Oscars, and that's what he wanted to do more than anything else in the world. And that Oscar cast in 1989 featured Rob Lowe singing Proud Mary with Snow White. And it ended up with a big lawsuit with Disney. In fact, it just resurfaced on YouTube this last time and got, like 1 million hits or something. And it is generally considered the worst Oscar telecast ever, and it ruined him. in any way, that is a book that I've written, and I'm polishing it up, and it should be out, February of next year.
Now, didn't Alan Carr have something? I want to say that he was connected to Grease too, wasn't he?
Yes, he produced Grease, and then which was, until Mamma Mia came along, the highest-grossing movie musical of all time. He also produced La Cage aux Folles on Broadway, which was huge. But then he also produced the only Village People movie called Can't Stop the Music. And when you're a biographer, you kind of have a couple of huge hits and a couple of huge flops. And to me, that's a book.
Did he have anything to do with Sgt. Pepper?
No, that was Robert Stigwood, and they produced
right?
Grease together. And then he worked on a few other things with Stigwood before that, but he was not involved in Sgt. Pepper. But it's interesting because Rob Lowe, because it was the 20th anniversary of the worst Oscar cast ever, was on a TV talk show recently, and he talked about, Alan Carr produced Grease and Sgt. Pepper, but he did not produce Sgt. Pepper.
Okay. Yeah, I knew Stigwood was connected, and I knew Carr had a connection there, but couldn't quite recall. Of course, Rob Lowe. I mean, what a history that guy's got. He's got the Snow White on the Oscars. He's got that hotel room video with the underage girls,
and then contributed.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That sex tape that came out actually kind of contributed to the fiasco of the Oscar cast, because it came out, it was revealed, and of course, went all over the world shortly after the Oscar fiasco. So it kind of led to, the Oscar fiasco was, not just a disaster, it was a debacle and whatever. So, that helped contribute to it.
Wow. Well, folks, you can buy Robert Hofler's new book, Varieties, the movie that changed my life, at great bookstores everywhere, or online at Amazon.com, and, of course, www.mrmedia.com. And, of course, for all the latest breaking news about Hollywood and entertainment, you should probably surf over to www.variety.com. And, Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And good luck with the book. It was a lot of fun to read.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. And, of course, for more great movie-related interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com, where you can listen to my earlier conversations with Kirk Douglas, Billy Bob Thornton, and many more. And please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Pointer Online, Digital Journal, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, or Odeo. Subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman.com. That's ANDELMAN. You can also follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, www.twitter.com/Andelman. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you give up a piece of your day to spend it with us.